"You're a burden now." Those were the last words Frank Alvarez heard before the door closed behind him. Not slammed, not angry, just final. At 78 years old, after a lifetime of building homes for other people, Frank stood on the sidewalk with a plastic bag of clothes and a single photograph pressed against his chest, a picture of his wife. The woman who used to say, "As long as we're together, we'll be okay." Tonight, he wasn't okay. The city around him kept moving, cars passing, lights changing, people heading somewhere warm, but Frank felt like he had been erased. Not fired, not divorced, not arrested, erased. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever wondered what happens when a man gives everything he has to his family and one day is told he's no longer worth keeping, then stay with this story. Because what happened next didn't involve flashing lights or dramatic miracles. It involved something far more unsettling, a stranger, a conversation, and a truth Frank had avoided for decades. Before we continue, if stories like this help you slow down and remember what really matters, subscribe to Heaven Walks With Us. These stories aren't about perfection, they're about people like Frank, ordinary, broken, and still worthy of love. Now, let's go back to the moment he stepped into the night, not knowing where he would sleep. The air in Fresno felt colder than usual that night, not because of the temperature, but because Frank Alvarez no longer had a place to escape it. He stood on the narrow strip of sidewalk in front of the small rented house he had lived in for 6 years. The porch light flicked off behind him. No goodbye. No second look. Just silence. In his left hand, Frank carried a torn plastic grocery bag. Inside were 2 faded shirts, a pair of work pants with a split seam, an old hoodie, and a framed photograph wrapped carefully in a dish towel. His wife, Elena. She had died 5 years earlier, and somehow even that loss hadn't hurt like this. Frank didn't shout. He didn't knock again. He didn't argue. Men like Frank didn't do that. He had spent his life believing that dignity meant staying quiet, absorbing the blows, and not becoming a problem. The words his daughter-in-law had thrown at him echoed anyway. "We can't afford this anymore. You don't help like you used to. The kids need space." None of them were technically lies. His hands weren't as steady, his back ached in the mornings, and the jobs he used to finish in a day now took him 2. Still, Frank had fixed fences, patched drywall, repaired leaking sinks, anything to justify his presence. It hadn't been enough. He began walking, not toward a destination, but away from the house that no longer wanted him. Each step felt heavier than the last. He passed homes he had worked on years earlier, fresh paint now peeling, fences still standing because his hands had built them right. Families lived there, laughed there, slept there. Frank wondered if any of them remembered the old man who had once knelt in their yards under the sun, measuring twice so nothing would fall apart later. A convenience store glowed ahead, warm, bright, safe. Frank paused near the entrance, hoping the heat from inside might reach him. The clerk glanced up, frowned, and shook his head. "Can't hang around here, sir." Frank nodded immediately and stepped back. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want pity. He just didn't want to disappear. As he continued down the street, the truth settled in slowly, like dust after demolition. Frank Alvarez hadn't just been asked to leave a house. He had been quietly removed from a life that no longer had room for him. And he had no idea that by morning, everything he believed about strength, purpose, and worth was about to be challenged. Frank kept walking, not because he knew where he was going, but because standing still felt too close to giving up. Fresno stretched out in front of him, familiar and strangely foreign at the same time. These were streets he had driven for decades in an old pickup truck, heading to job sites before sunrise, coffee balanced on the dashboard, radio murmuring quietly in the background. Now he walked them like a visitor who didn't quite belong. He passed a row of small houses near the edge of the neighborhood. Years ago he had repaired a sagging porch on one of them, replacing rotten boards with fresh lumber. He remembered the homeowner shaking his hand afterward, thanking him for saving the whole place. The porch was still standing. Frank wondered if the family inside remembered his name. Probably not. A bus roared past him, headlights flaring briefly in the dark. Through the windows, he saw faces, people heading home from late shifts, earbuds in, eyes tired, but focused on somewhere warm. No one looked his way. That was the strange part. It wasn't that people were cruel. It was that they didn't see him at all. Frank stopped near a small strip mall where a hardware store used to be. The sign was gone now, replaced by something newer and brighter. He stood there for a moment, remembering mornings spent inside places like that, talking tools, swapping job tips, laughing about sore backs and stubborn clients. Back then, he belonged. His stomach growled, sharp and insistent. He realized he hadn't eaten since early morning. At the house, dinner had already been served when the argument started. He hadn't sat down, hadn't reached for a plate. He told himself he wasn't hungry. Now his body disagreed. Frank checked his pockets. One folded bill, some loose change, enough for maybe a small snack. If he wanted to spend it, he hesitated. Money felt heavier when you didn't know what tomorrow looked like. As he walked, he caught his reflection in a darkened storefront window. The man staring back startled him. His hair was thinner than he remembered. His shoulders sloped forward, not from weakness, but from years of carrying weight without complaint. His eyes, those looked tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. He didn't look dangerous. He didn't look drunk. He didn't even look particularly old. He just looked unnecessary. Frank turned away from the glass. For the first time, a thought crept in that scared him more than the cold. What if this was it? What if, from now on, the world would only see him as a problem to move along, a figure to avoid, a shadow at the edge of someone else's life? The streetlights flickered on one by one. Night was settling in, and Frank Alvarez, who had spent his entire life building spaces for others to feel safe, realized he no longer had a place that belonged to him. Frank reached the small park just as the last traces of daylight faded from the sky. It wasn't much, just a few benches, a patch of dry grass, and a tired-looking playground that hadn't heard children's laughter in a long time. But it was quiet, and quiet felt safer than wandering the streets with nowhere to go. He sat down on a concrete bench, the cold seeping through his jeans almost immediately. Across from him, a man wrapped in a blanket rummaged through a trash can, moving with the slow efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Frank looked away, not out of judgment, but out of fear. That's going to be me, he thought. Maybe not tonight, but soon. He pulled the photograph of Elena from his bag and held it in both hands. Her smile was frozen in time, gentle, steady, confident in a future that had never included this moment. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not sure who he was apologizing to. Footsteps approached from behind. "Sir?" Frank turned, startled. A police officer stood a few feet away, hands resting casually on his belt. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't unkind, just tired, like everyone else who worked nights. "This park closes after dark," the officer said. "You got some place to go?" Frank opened his mouth to answer. Nothing came out. He searched his mind for a word that would make this situation disappear, a name, an address, a simple lie. Instead, he handed over his worn ID with shaking fingers. The officer glanced at it, then back at Frank. "You live around here?" Frank swallowed. "No," he said quietly. "Not anymore." The officer studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "There's a shelter a few miles from here," he said, "but it's probably full by now." Frank nodded, though the word shelter made his chest tighten. The officer hesitated, then asked the question that would follow Frank long after the night was over. "So, are you homeless?" The word landed between them like a dropped tool, heavy, loud, impossible to ignore. Frank stared at the ground. Homeless. It didn't feel real. He had paid taxes, raised a family, built homes, fixed broken things, lived quietly, respectably. Homeless was a word for other people. "I guess so," he said finally, his voice barely audible. The officer exhaled, a mix of sympathy and resignation. "I don't want to hassle you," he said, "but you can't stay here tonight. It's not safe." Frank nodded again, faster this time, too fast. "I'll move," he said. "I'm sorry." The officer handed back his ID and stepped away. As Frank stood, his knees protested, stiff and slow. He slung the plastic bag over his shoulder and took one last look at the bench. For a brief moment he had imagined resting there, closing his eyes, pretending the world would pause. It wouldn't. As he walked away, the word echoed in his mind, each repetition stripping something away. Homeless. It wasn't just a description. It was a verdict. And for the first time in his life, Frank Alvarez felt truly afraid, not of hunger, not of cold, but of what it meant to no longer belong anywhere at all. Frank had walked for nearly 20 minutes when his legs finally began to tremble. Not from weakness, but from exhaustion layered on top of fear. He slowed near the edge of a quiet residential block, unsure why he'd turned there. The houses were small, older, most with chain-link fences and porches that sagged slightly with age. Porch lights glowed softly, not bright enough to draw attention, but warm enough to suggest life inside. Frank stopped beside a low wall and sat down carefully, lowering himself as if afraid the ground might reject him too. That's when he heard a voice. "Sir, are you okay?" He looked up, startled again, but this time not afraid. A woman stood a few feet away, holding a reusable grocery bag in one hand. She was in her early 70s, wrapped in a thick sweater, her gray hair pulled back neatly. Her eyes held concern, not suspicion. Frank straightened instinctively. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'm fine." It was a lie, but it was an old habit. She studied him for a moment, then glanced at the plastic bag by his feet, the way his shoulders hunched against the cold. "You look cold," she said gently, "and tired." Frank hesitated. Something about her tone made it difficult to brush her off. "I just needed to sit," he replied. She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "My name's Dolores," she said. "Most people call me Dee." Frank shifted, unsure what to say next. "I'm Frank." "Well, Frank," she said, "I was just heading home. I live right there." She pointed to a small house across the street. "I've got some hot tea on the stove." Frank shook his head immediately. "No, thank you," he said. "I don't want to trouble you." She smiled, not amused, not offended. "Honey," she said softly, "you're not troubling me. You're just sitting." Her words caught him off guard. No one had spoken to him like that all night. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small bottle of water, holding it out without ceremony. "At least take this," she said. "It's cold out here." Frank took it, his hands brushing hers for just a second. They were warm. "Thank you," he said quietly. They sat there for a moment, neither speaking. Cars passed in the distance. Somewhere a dog barked. Finally Frank exhaled, long and shaky. "My family asked me to leave," he said, surprising himself. Dolores didn't gasp, didn't ask questions, didn't rush to fill the silence. She just listened. "That's very hard," she said after a moment. Frank nodded, his throat tight. "I worked my whole life," he added. "I never thought I'd end up like this." Dolores placed her grocery bag on the ground and turned slightly toward him. "Why don't you come with me?" she said. "Just for tonight. You can warm up, have something to eat. Then tomorrow, you decide what's next." Frank stared at her, a stranger, offering him more dignity in 2 minutes than he had felt all day. "I don't want you to think," he began. "I think," she interrupted gently, that you're a man who's had a very long day." She stood and extended her hand. For the first time since the door had closed behind him, Frank felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not relief, hope. Dolores's house was small, but it felt alive. The moment Frank stepped inside, warmth wrapped around him, not just from the heater humming softly in the corner, but from the quiet order of a place that had been cared for. The floors were clean. The furniture was worn, but intentional. Framed photographs lined the walls, children in graduation caps, smiling couples. A younger Dolores standing beside a man Frank assumed had once been her husband. "Sit," she said, nodding toward a modest kitchen table. "I'll put the kettle back on." Frank lowered himself into the chair slowly, his joints protesting as if reminding him of everything he'd lost with time. He rested his hands on the table, rough palms spread wide, and stared at the grain of the wood beneath them. It reminded him of workbenches, of sawdust, of days when his hands had purpose. Dolores moved quietly around the kitchen, the clink of ceramic and the hiss of boiling water filling the space between them. She didn't ask questions, didn't push. She simply worked, as if feeding someone who needed it was the most natural thing in the world. She set a mug of tea in front of him, steam curling upward. "Careful," she said. "It's hot." Frank wrapped his hands around the mug. The heat seeped into his fingers, traveled up his arms, and settled somewhere deep in his chest. "Thank you," he murmured. She placed a small plate beside the mug, beans, a tortilla, a piece of bread. Simple food, honest food. Frank hesitated. "Go on," she said. "You need it." He took a bite. It tasted like more than food. It tasted like permission. For a few minutes they ate in silence. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, grounding the moment. Finally, Dolores spoke. "My husband passed 10 years ago," she said. "Cancer." Frank looked up. "I'm sorry," she nodded. "You learn a lot about loneliness after that." He swallowed hard. "My wife, Elena," he said. 5 years?" Dolores met his eyes. No pity, just recognition. "It's quiet after," she said. "Too quiet." Frank nodded. The words pressed against something he had avoided for years. "I don't like asking for help," he admitted suddenly. "Never have." Dolores smiled gently. "Most men your age don't." Frank stared into his tea. "My father used to say a man's job is to carry things," he continued. "Work, responsibility, pain. You carry it so your family doesn't have to." He paused. "I think I carried it so long, I forgot how to set it down." Dolores leaned against the counter, listening. "They didn't throw me out because they hate me," Frank added quietly. "They threw me out because I'm not useful anymore." The word hung in the air. Useful. Dolores shook her head slowly. "Frank," she said, "useful is not the same as valuable." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "It feels the same when you're old." She didn't argue, didn't rush to correct him. Instead, she said, "You can sleep on the couch tonight. It's not fancy, but it's warm." Frank felt something tighten behind his eyes. "I don't know how to repay you," he said. Dolores waved the idea away. "You don't owe me anything," she replied. "Just rest." As Frank settled onto the couch later that night, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of laundry soap, he stared at the ceiling and listened to the quiet hum of the house. For the first time since being told he was a burden, he felt something loosen its grip around his heart. He still had no job, no home, no plan. But he wasn't alone, and that for now was enough to let him sleep. Frank woke just after sunrise to the sound of traffic in the distance and the faint smell of coffee drifting through the house. For a brief moment, half asleep, disoriented, he thought he was back in his old room, that Elena was still alive, that everything was normal. Then reality returned. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face with both hands. Dolores was already awake, standing at the stove with a small pot simmering. She handed him a mug without a word. Thank you for last night, Frank said. I won't stay long. I'm going to look for work. She nodded, as if she had expected nothing else. You do what you need to do, she said. Just don't disappear. Frank promised he wouldn't, even though he wasn't sure where he could go. After breakfast, he stepped back out into Fresno's morning light. The city felt different during the day, busier, louder, more impatient. People walked faster, doors opened and closed without hesitation. Frank headed first to a lumberyard he had known for years. The man behind the counter recognized him vaguely. You still working? The man asked. Looking, Frank replied. The man glanced at Frank's hands, his posture, the lines etched into his face. We're really looking for younger guys right now, he said. Insurance, you know how it is. Frank nodded. He tried a small construction office next, then a hardware store, then a repair shop with a handwritten "Help Wanted" sign taped crookedly to the window. Each conversation followed the same pattern: polite smiles, careful words, and the same ending. You've got great experience, sir. We just need someone faster. It's nothing personal. By midday, Frank's legs ached. His hope thinned with every rejection. He sat on the edge of a planter outside a closed storefront and watched younger men unload tools from a truck, laughing, moving quickly, not thinking twice about their bodies or their place in the world. Once, that had been him. Frank looked down at his hands again. They were still strong, still capable. But strength, he was learning, was no longer enough. As the afternoon wore on, a heavy understanding settled in. It wasn't that no one needed work done, it was that no one needed him to do it. By early evening, Frank found himself walking without intention again, feet carrying him somewhere familiar without his permission. He stopped at the steps of a small church near the edge of downtown Fresno. The doors were closed, but the stone steps were cool and shaded. Frank sat down carefully, exhaling as if setting down something invisible and heavy. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to admit the truth. He didn't just need a job. He needed to know that his life still mattered. He stared at the ground, lost in thought, unaware that someone was about to sit down beside him and challenge everything he believed about work, worth, and what it meant to still be useful. Frank had been staring at the ground so long that he didn't notice the footsteps at first. They were unhurried, unforced. Someone stopped near the bottom of the church steps. Then, without asking, the stranger sat down beside him. Not too close, not too far, just enough to feel like company. It gets hot out here, the man said casually, as if they were two old acquaintances sharing a bench. Even when the air's cool. Frank glanced sideways. The man looked to be in his early 30s, clean but plainly dressed. Jeans, worn sneakers, a gray hoodie zipped halfway up. His hair was dark and slightly unkempt. His beard trimmed but not styled. There was nothing remarkable about him, and yet something about the way he sat felt different. Frank nodded. Yeah, he said. It does. They sat in silence for a moment, watching a pair of pigeons hop across the courtyard. The man didn't check his phone, didn't look distracted. He seemed completely present. You look like someone who's been working hard all his life, the man said eventually. Frank let out a short, humorless breath. Used to. The man smiled slightly, not amused, just understanding. What kind of work? Carpentry, Frank replied. Handyman stuff, houses, fences, repairs. The man nodded, as if that answer mattered. That's good work, he said. Honest. Frank studied him now. You hiring? The man chuckled softly. Not exactly. Frank looked away again, embarrassed by his own bluntness. I've been looking all day, he added, more to himself than to the stranger. Nobody wants an old man who moves slow. The man didn't rush to contradict him. Instead, he said something unexpected. Maybe you're looking for the wrong kind of job. Frank frowned. What does that mean? The man tilted his head slightly, considering his words. I mean, he said, Sometimes when what we used to do is taken away, it's not because we've lost our value, but because we're being invited to discover it somewhere else. Frank scoffed quietly. That sounds nice. Doesn't pay rent. The man didn't seem offended. No, he agreed. It doesn't. Another pause. Frank felt strangely unsettled, not because the man was intrusive, but because his words were landing somewhere Frank hadn't opened in a long time. They watched a woman cross the street with a grocery bag, struggling slightly with its weight. "Can I ask you something?" the man said. Frank shrugged. "Sure." "When you were building houses," the man asked, "what was the most important part?" Frank didn't hesitate. "The foundation." The man nodded. "Why?" "Because if the foundation's off," Frank said, warming to the question, "everything else cracks eventually. Walls, doors, roof. Doesn't matter how good it looks on the surface." The man smiled. "That makes sense." He turned to Frank then, really looked at him. "And tell me," he said gently, "what kind of foundation did you build with your son?" The question hit Frank like a sudden gust of cold air. He opened his mouth to answer. Nothing came out. For a moment, the noise of the city faded. Frank felt the weight of years press down on his chest, long hours at work, missed conversations, silence, mistaken for strength. "How do you know I have a son?" Frank asked quietly. The man met his eyes. "I know a lot of things," he said. Frank swallowed. "What's your name?" The man's smile returned, soft, steady. "Jesus," he said. Frank blinked. "Jesus?" "Yes," the man replied simply. "Like him?" For a fleeting second, a strange thought crossed Frank's mind, one he immediately dismissed as foolish. Still, something about the way the man said his name made Frank's heart beat faster, as if this conversation was only just beginning. Frank didn't answer right away. The name lingered in the air between them, light and heavy at the same time. "Jesus," he repeated quietly, more to himself than to the man beside him. "Yes," the man said again, as if there were nothing unusual about it. "Names are just names." Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "About what you asked," he said finally. "My son." Jesus waited. Frank stared at the stone steps beneath his boots. He traced a crack in the concrete with the tip of his shoe, following it the way he once followed chalk lines on unfinished floors. "I built everything for him," Frank said. "Worked double shifts, took extra jobs, missed birthdays, missed dinners, missed a lot." He swallowed. "But he never went without. Never had to worry about food or clothes. He went to school, had opportunities I never did." Jesus nodded slowly. "Those are important things," he said. Frank looked up, relieved, until Jesus continued. "But are those the foundations you're talking about?" Frank's jaw tightened. "What else was I supposed to do?" he asked. "That's what fathers do. We provide." "Yes," Jesus said gently, "you provided. But did you ever tell him you were proud of him when he failed?" Frank felt his chest constrict. "Did you ever tell him you needed him," Jesus went on, "instead of letting him believe you were unbreakable?" The questions came quietly, calmly, but each one landed with precision. Frank shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "My father never said things like that," he said. "He worked. That was how he showed love." Jesus leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. "And how did that make you feel?" Frank's throat tightened. He hadn't expected that question. "Like I was always trying to earn something," he admitted. "Like if I worked hard enough, maybe one day he'd say something." Jesus let the silence stretch. Frank felt memories rising uninvited, himself as a boy, standing in a doorway with a report card in his hand. Later, as a teenager, coming home late after a long day of labor, then, as a young man, holding his own newborn son for the first time, vowing silently to be better. "I thought I was," Frank said, his voice breaking. "I thought if I gave my son everything, that would be enough." Jesus turned toward him. "Frank," he said softly, "you taught your son responsibility, discipline. endurance. Those are strong foundations. Frank nodded weakly. But you also taught him, Jesus continued, that love is quiet, distant, and never asks for help. The words cut deep. Frank pressed his palms against his thighs, grounding himself. I didn't know how to do it differently, he whispered. Men in my world didn't talk about feelings. We carried things alone. Jesus reached out and placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't forceful. But warmth spread from that simple touch, seeping into places Frank had kept closed for decades. You are not your father, Jesus said, and your son doesn't need you to be perfect. He needs you to be real. Frank's eyes filled. My son lives far away, he said. California's expensive. Life's hard. I didn't want to bother him. Jesus met his gaze. Have you ever told him you miss him? Frank shook his head. Have you ever told him you need him? The word need echoed painfully. No, Frank said. Fathers don't say that. Jesus smiled, not sadly, but with quiet assurance. Fathers who want healing do. Frank broke then. The tears came slowly at first, then all at once. Years of restraint dissolving in the space between two men sitting on church steps. I don't even know if he wants to hear from me anymore, Frank confessed. What if I call and he doesn't answer? Jesus squeezed his shoulder gently. And what if he does? Frank closed his eyes. For the first time since being told he was a burden, a thought surfaced that frightened him more than rejection. What if the foundation could still be repaired? What if it wasn't too late? When Frank opened his eyes again, he felt something shift, not around him, but within him, and he didn't yet realize that this conversation was about to change everything. Frank stayed seated long after the tears stopped. The air felt different now, lighter somehow, as if something heavy had been lifted off his chest and set down beside him. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, embarrassed by how easily he had unraveled in front of a stranger. I don't usually cry, he muttered. Jesus didn't respond right away. Frank turned slightly, ready to add something, an apology, maybe a joke to cover the vulnerability. But the step beside him was empty. He blinked and looked again. Jesus was gone. Frank straightened, heart quickening. He scanned the courtyard, the sidewalk, the street beyond the church gate. A few people passed in the distance, but none of them looked like the man who had been sitting next to him just moments ago. Hey, Frank called softly. Jesus? No answer. A woman emerged from the church doors, pulling her coat tighter around herself. She paused when she noticed Frank sitting alone. Are you all right, sir? She asked kindly. I saw you earlier. You looked upset. Frank hesitated, then nodded. Yes, ma'am, I'm fine. She glanced at the empty steps. Were you talking to someone? Frank followed her gaze, then shook his head slowly. No, he said, just thinking. She smiled gently, the way people do when they don't want to pry, and continued on her way. Frank sat back, confusion washing over him. Had he imagined the whole thing? The questions, the name, the warmth of a hand on his shoulder? He pressed his palm against the spot where Jesus had touched him. It still felt warm. That's not possible, he whispered, and yet the words lingered in his mind with a clarity that felt sharper than memory. You are not your father. Your son needs you to be real. What if he does answer? Frank took a long, steadying breath. Even if the man had been a figment of exhaustion and grief, the truth he had spoken was real. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and felt the familiar shape of his old phone, the one his son had given him years ago, insisting he keep it charged just in case. He pulled it out slowly. The screen lit up. Frank stared at his reflection in the dark glass for a moment, seeing a man caught between who he had been and who he might still become. Okay, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Okay. Whatever had happened on those steps, real or imagined, it had stirred something he could no longer ignore. Frank Alvarez, who had spent his life avoiding the risk of emotional pain, now faced a different kind of fear, the fear of finally saying what had gone unsaid for decades. And this time, he wasn't sure he could walk away from it. Frank held the phone in his hand longer than he meant to. The screen glowed softly, reflecting his face back at him, older, worn, uncertain. His thumb hovered over the contact name he hadn't pressed in weeks. Michael, his son. Frank had memorized the number years ago, back when Michael first moved away for work, and insisted his father learn how to use a smartphone. Just in case, Michael had said. Frank exhaled slowly. What would he say? Your wife kicked me out sounded like an accusation. I have nowhere to sleep sounded like a plea. Neither felt right. He thought again of the words spoken on the steps. Fathers who want healing do. Before he could change his mind, Frank pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. His chest tightened. He was already preparing himself for voicemail when the line clicked. Dad? Michael's voice sounded surprised, alert, almost worried. Frank swallowed. Hey, son, he said. His voice cracked slightly. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. There was a pause. No, Michael said quickly. No, it's fine. It's not like you to call out of the blue. Is everything okay? Frank closed his eyes. This was the moment. I'm okay, he said, choosing his words carefully. But I need to talk to you. Another pause, longer this time. What's going on? Michael asked. Frank tightened his grip on the phone. Your wife asked me to leave, he said quietly. Silence. I mean, we argued, Frank added, instinctively trying to soften the blow. Things got tense. That doesn't make sense, Michael said. Ashley wouldn't just... She did, Frank said. Not angrily, just honestly. I'm not there anymore. Michael's breath caught on the other end. Dad, where are you right now? Frank hesitated. With a friend, he said. I'm safe. Another silence settled between them, heavy and unfamiliar. I didn't know it was that bad, Michael finally said. Why didn't you tell me? Frank let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Because I didn't want to be a burden, he said. I didn't want you worrying about me when you've got your own life. Michael didn't answer right away. Frank could hear movement, maybe Michael stepping away from work or into a quieter space. Dad, Michael said slowly, you're not a burden. Frank felt his throat tighten. I didn't call you to fix anything, he said quickly. I didn't call for money or a place to stay. Then why did you call? Michael asked, his voice softer now. Frank's heart pounded. He stared at the concrete beneath his feet, then closed his eyes and let the truth come out. Because I miss you, he said, a pause, and because I need my son. The words hung there, fragile and exposed. On the other end of the line, Michael's breath hitched. Dad, he said quietly, I miss you too. Frank opened his eyes, stunned. I think about you all the time, Michael continued. I just didn't know how to say it. We've never talked like this before. I know, Frank said. We were never taught how. There was a faint sound, Michael sniffing, clearing his throat. I should have called more, Michael said. I should have asked how you were really doing. Frank shook his head gently. I didn't make it easy, he admitted. I always acted like I had everything under control. Another pause, different this time. Not distance, connection. Dad, Michael said, his voice steadier now, I'm going to talk to Ashley. We'll figure something out. Frank smiled sadly. Thank you, he said. But whatever happens, I just needed you to know something. What's that? Frank felt warmth spread through his chest. I love you, he said. And I'm proud of you, always have been. On the other end of the line, Michael didn't try to hide his tears. I love you too, Dad, he said. I really do. When the call finally ended, Frank lowered the phone slowly. Nothing around him had changed. He still didn't have a home. he still didn't have a job. His future was still uncertain. But something essential had shifted. For the first time in years, Frank Alvarez no longer felt like a burden. He felt like a father again. Frank stayed on the church steps long after the call ended. The phone rested in his palm, dark and silent now, but the words it had carried still echoed in his chest. "I miss you. I need my son." He had said them out loud, and the world hadn't collapsed. Frank leaned back slightly and let his shoulders relax for the first time that day. The tight knot that had lived in his chest for years, tightened by pride, silence, and the need to appear strong, had loosened just enough for him to breathe. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the courtyard. That was when he noticed the garden. It sat off to the side of the church, half hidden behind a low stone wall. Frank was sure it hadn't caught his attention before. Or maybe it had, but only now did he have the stillness to really see it. The soil looked dry, cracked, neglected. Weeds grew where flowers once must have been. Old stems leaned against one another, brittle and gray. Frank stood and walked toward it slowly. Up close, the place looked abandoned, like someone had started caring once, then given up when life got in the way. He crouched down, resting one knee against the ground. As he studied the dirt, something caught his eye. A small patch of green, barely noticeable, just a few fragile leaves pushing up through the hardened soil. Frank stared at it, surprised. He reached out carefully and brushed the dirt aside with his fingers. "It's alive," he murmured. The plant wasn't strong yet, it wasn't impressive, but it was there, quietly insisting on growth where no one expected it. Frank sat back on his heels. The thought came to him uninvited, but unmistakably clear. Maybe things don't need to be perfect to start again. He stood brushing dirt from his hands and glanced back at the steps where he had been sitting earlier. Jesus was gone. And yet, Frank didn't feel abandoned. He felt guided. That night, Frank returned to Dolores's house. She noticed the change immediately. "You look lighter," she said, handing him a bowl of soup. Frank smiled faintly. "I talked to my son," he said. Dolores nodded as if she had known he would. As Frank settled onto the couch later that evening, the image of the small green plant stayed with him. For the first time since everything fell apart, he didn't fall asleep wondering how much worse things could get. He fell asleep wondering, quietly, cautiously, what might still be possible. Frank returned to the church the next morning without quite knowing why. It wasn't part of a plan. It wasn't obligation. It was something quieter, an inner pull he couldn't explain. The air was cool, the kind of Central Valley morning that carried the promise of heat later on. The courtyard was nearly empty. A few people drifted in and out of the church doors, heads bowed, moving with their own private concerns. Frank sat on the same stone steps as the day before. He waited. Minutes passed. Then more. A small part of him wondered if he had imagined everything, if exhaustion and grief had created a moment that felt sacred but wasn't real. He was about to stand when he heard footsteps, unhurried, familiar. "You came back." Frank looked up. Jesus stood a few feet away, hands in the pockets of his hoodie, expression calm as ever. "You're real," Frank said, before he could stop himself. Jesus smiled. "Why wouldn't I be?" "You disappeared," Frank replied. "No one else saw you." Jesus sat beside him again, just as before. "Sometimes people only see what they're ready to see," he said. Frank shook his head slowly, still trying to understand. "I talked to my son," he said, "like you said." Jesus nodded, as if that outcome had never been in doubt. "How did it feel?" Frank thought for a moment. "Like I set down something I didn't know I was carrying," he said. "Like I finally told the truth." Jesus looked toward the courtyard, where a man sat alone on a bench with his head in his hands. "Frank," he said quietly, "you didn't lose your purpose when you lost your job." Frank frowned. Then what is it? Jesus turned back to him. You spent your life building things so other people could feel safe, he said. Now you're being asked to build something different. Frank followed his gaze to the man on the bench. I don't have answers for people, Frank said. I can barely keep my own life together. Jesus smiled gently. That's exactly why you're ready. Frank looked confused. People don't need perfect answers, Jesus continued. They need someone who understands what it feels like to fall apart and still get up. Frank felt the truth of those words settle into him. What are you saying? He asked. Jesus gestured subtly toward the man again. Go sit with him, he said. You don't need to fix anything, just listen. Frank hesitated. What if I say the wrong thing? Jesus met his eyes. Then you'll still be present, he said. And that matters more than you know. Frank exhaled slowly. He stood feeling uncertain, but not afraid. When he turned back to say something else, Jesus was already rising from the steps. Wait, Frank said. Will I see you again? Jesus paused. You already are, he replied, glancing toward the man on the bench. Every time you choose compassion over fear. Frank watched as Jesus walked away, blending effortlessly into the movement of the street beyond the church gates. This time, Frank didn't chase after him. He took a breath and walked toward the man who needed someone to sit beside him. Frank approached the man on the bench slowly, careful not to startle him. The man looked to be in his early 50s, shoulders slumped forward, elbows resting on his knees. His hands were clenched together so tightly, his knuckles had gone pale. Whatever he was carrying, it was heavy. Mind if I sit? Frank asked. The man glanced up, surprised, then shook his head. No, go ahead. Frank sat beside him, leaving space. He remembered how important that space had felt just a day earlier. They sat in silence at first. Frank didn't rush it. After a few minutes, the man exhaled sharply, like someone who had been holding his breath too long. I lost my job, the man said suddenly. 22 years, same company. Frank nodded. That's a long time. They said they needed someone younger, the man continued bitterly. Cheaper, faster. He laughed once, hollow. Guess I expired. Frank felt the words land close to home. What's your name? He asked. Robert. I'm Frank. Robert nodded but kept staring at the ground. I don't know why I'm here, Robert said. I'm not even religious. Frank smiled faintly. Neither was I, he said. Not like this. That caught Robert's attention. Frank didn't give advice, didn't quote scripture, didn't pretend to have solutions. He just told the truth. I was told I wasn't useful anymore, Frank said. That's a hard thing to hear. Robert looked at him, eyes searching. And what did you do? He asked. Frank thought for a moment. I listened, he said, to someone who reminded me that my value didn't disappear when my job did. They talked for nearly an hour. When Robert finally stood to leave, his problems were still there, but his shoulders were a little less hunched. Thanks, Robert said quietly. I didn't know how much I needed that. Frank watched him walk away, surprised by the warmth in his own chest. The next day, Frank came back. And the day after that. At first, it was accidental. People noticed the older man sitting on the steps, calm and attentive, never rushing, never judging. One woman sat down, then another. A young man lingered nearby, pretending to check his phone, until Frank looked up and nodded. I can come back later, the young man said. No, Frank replied. Sit. The young man's name was Carlos. He was 25, restless, eyes dulled by exhaustion and regret. I keep messing up, Carlos admitted. Drugs, rehab, relapse. My family's done with me. Frank didn't flinch. I buried my wife, he said, and after that, I lost myself for a while, too. Carlos blinked. You don't look like someone who ever messed up. Frank smiled sadly. That's because I learned how to hide it. Carlos came back the next day. Then there was Maria, a 35-year-old single mother who worked double shifts at a packaging plant. She sat down one afternoon holding an eviction notice, hands trembling. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she whispered. "I can't lose my kids." Frank listened. And when he spoke, it wasn't as an expert, but as someone who understood fear. "You're still standing," he said. "That tells me more about you than any paper ever could." Word spread quietly, not through announcements, not through sermons, through presence. People began bringing coffee. Someone left a blanket on the steps. Robert returned one afternoon and sat beside Frank, offering to help others with resumes. Carlos mentioned he knew basic plumbing and could fix things if anyone needed help. Maria offered to help people fill out forms. Without realizing it, something formed, not a program, not a ministry, a circle. Frank noticed the garden again, how the small green patch had grown, leaves reaching outward, stronger now. He understood the metaphor instinctively. No single plant made a garden. It took many roots sharing the same soil. One afternoon, Dolores stopped by with a container of food. She watched the group quietly, eyes soft. "You did this," she said to Frank. He shook his head. "No," he replied. "I just sat down." And for the first time in a very long while, Frank Alvarez didn't feel like a burden. He felt useful, not because he was fixing things, but because he was present. Frank hadn't noticed the change at first. It happened quietly, like everything else that mattered. One afternoon, as he sat on the church steps listening to Maria talk about her kids' school schedules, he realized something strange. People weren't just coming to talk anymore. They were coming early, they were staying late, and they were watching him with concern. "Frank," Robert said one evening as the sun dipped low, "can I ask you something?" "Sure," Frank replied. "Where are you staying?" Robert asked carefully. Frank hesitated. "With a friend," he said. "Just for now." The group exchanged glances. Carlos shifted uncomfortably. Maria bit her lip. "How long is just for now?" Maria asked gently. Frank opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't want to impose." Maria shook her head firmly. "You're not imposing." Carlos stepped forward. "You listened to all of us. You showed up every day. You didn't judge. You didn't rush us." Robert nodded. "You helped me remember I'm more than a resume." Frank felt his chest tighten. "That doesn't mean you owe me anything," he said quickly. "That's the thing," Maria replied. "We don't owe you. We want to." Frank looked at them, confused. Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a small set of keys. "My brother has a detached garage unit behind his house," he said. "It's nothing fancy. He used it for storage. We cleaned it out." Carlos added, "I fixed the sink. It was leaking." "And I brought a mattress," Maria said. "My cousin donated it." Frank stared at the keys. "You did all this for me?" Robert shrugged. "That's what family does." The word hit Frank harder than he expected. Family. "I don't know how to receive this," Frank said honestly. "My whole life, I was the one giving." Maria smiled softly. "Then maybe this is the next thing you're supposed to learn." Frank felt his eyes burn. That evening, they walked together to see the place. It was small, a single room, a tiny kitchenette, a bathroom that worked, clean, quiet. On the wall hung a simple photo, taken just days earlier on the church steps, all of them together, smiling. Frank sank onto the edge of the bed and pressed his palms into his knees. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. Carlos crouched in front of him. "Neither did I," he said. "That's kind of the point." Later that night, as Frank lay alone in the small space, the silence felt different than it had before. Not empty, peaceful. He thought of Dolores opening her door, of Robert sitting down beside him, of Jesus' quiet voice telling him to build something new. Frank Alvarez had spent decades believing strength meant standing alone. Now, surrounded by the evidence of shared effort and shared care, he understood something that had taken a lifetime to learn. Receiving love wasn't weakness, it was trust. And trust, he realized as he closed his eyes that night, was the strongest foundation he had ever known. December arrived quietly in Fresno. The mornings grew colder, the air sharper. Lights began to appear in windows along the street, small and hopeful against the early darkness. Frank noticed the change not by the calendar, but by the way people lingered longer on the church steps, warming their hands around paper cups of coffee, reluctant to leave the circle that had formed there. On Christmas Eve, the courtyard felt different, not crowded, just full. Maria arrived with her children, bundled in mismatched jackets. Robert brought his wife, who hugged Frank tightly after finally meeting the man who had helped her husband stand straighter again. Carlos showed up sober, 6 months now, his smile steady, his eyes clearer than Frank had ever seen them. Dolores came last, carrying a pot of soup and humming softly as she walked. And then Michael arrived. Frank spotted him before Michael saw him, standing a little unsure at the edge of the courtyard, scanning faces, searching. Frank stood. For a moment, neither moved. Then Michael stepped forward, closing the distance in 3 quick strides and pulling his father into an embrace that felt overdue by decades. "I'm here, Dad," Michael said. "I'm really here." Frank held him, feeling the weight and warmth of his son's presence. "I know," Frank replied. "That's enough." They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. Laughter drifted through the courtyard. Someone strummed a guitar softly. Children chased each other between the benches, their breath visible in the cold air. Frank stepped aside for a moment, needing a quiet breath. That was when he felt it. A presence. "Looks like you built something solid," a familiar voice said. Frank turned. Jesus stood a few feet away, hands tucked into his hoodie, eyes warm with recognition. "I didn't do it alone," Frank said. Jesus smiled. "You never were meant to." Frank hesitated, then asked the question that had been sitting in his chest for weeks. "Why me?" Jesus tilted his head slightly. "Because you were willing to let yourself be seen," he said. "And because you learned that love isn't proven by how much you endure alone, but by how much you allow others to walk with you." Frank nodded slowly. "I'm still scared sometimes," he admitted. "Still not sure I'm enough." Jesus stepped closer and placed a hand on Frank's shoulder, just as before. "No one is enough by themselves," he said gently. "That's the whole point." Frank blinked, and Jesus was gone. But this time there was no confusion, no doubt. Frank turned back to the courtyard, to the people laughing, eating, sharing warmth in the cold. He understood now. He had never been a burden. He had been a bridge, between pain and healing, between loneliness and belonging, between what was broken and what could still be made whole. As the evening drew to a close, Frank slipped 2 photographs into his pocket. One was old, the faded image of Elena, smiling as she always had. The other was new. A group photo taken moments earlier, a family formed not by blood alone, but by choice. Frank Alvarez, 78 years old, former carpenter, sat down on the church steps and watched the lights glow around him. He hadn't built another house. He had built something better. And somewhere beyond the quiet streets of Fresno, love continued its work, one person at a time. If this story stayed with you, it's probably because you recognize something in Frank. Not the details, not the setting, but the feeling, the quiet fear of becoming invisible, the weight of being strong for so long that you forget how to be honest. The question no one asks out loud, am I still valuable if I'm no longer needed the way I used to be? Frank didn't find purpose by fixing his life overnight. He didn't suddenly become young again. He didn't earn love by proving himself. He found healing the moment he allowed himself to be seen, by his son, by strangers, and by a quiet presence that reminded him he was never abandoned. Maybe you're watching this as a parent who never learned how to say, "I need you." Maybe you're the child who moved far away and hasn't called enough. Or maybe you're someone who feels like life passed you by, leaving you on the sidelines. If that's you, let this be your reminder. You are not a burden. You are not too late. And your story is not finished. If this message spoke to you, take a moment to reflect and then share it. Tell us in the comments who in your life might need to hear that they still matter. And if you want more stories like this, stories about quiet miracles, human dignity, and the moments where heaven meets everyday life, subscribe to Heaven Walks with Us. You never know which story might meet you exactly where you are, and neither does the person who needs you to stay.